December 7th, 1959, 8:43 p.m. The Metropolitan Opera House was presenting La Traviata to a sold-out audience of New York's cultural elite. In the orchestra section, ladies in elegant gowns applauded between acts. In the private box seats, gentlemen in tuxedos sipped champagne and discussed art. What the 3,000 audience members didn't know was that in Box 12, the most exclusive private box in the opera house, a very different kind of performance was taking place. Joe Colombo and 14 of his most trusted lieutenants were conducting the final planning session for what they called the Harlem Solution. At 9:17 p.m., Box 12 erupted in flames. 15 men burned alive in their evening wear while 3,000 people watched in horror from below. The official investigation would call it an electrical fire caused by faulty wiring in the historic building. The truth was far more sinister. Bumpy Johnson had turned the Metropolitan Opera House into a crematorium for his enemies. To understand why Bumpy Johnson chose such a public, spectacular method to eliminate Joe Colombo, you need to understand the threat Colombo represented in late 1959. He wasn't just another mob boss trying to muscle into Harlem. He was a strategic genius who understood that controlling culture meant controlling power. Joe Colombo had spent 18 months systematically infiltrating New York's cultural institutions. He'd placed his people on museum boards, theater committees, and charity organizations. His ultimate goal was to use these legitimate cultural connections to isolate Harlem socially and economically. The plan was brilliant. Convince New York's cultural elite that Harlem was unsuitable for artistic investment, cut off funding for community programs, redirect cultural events away from Harlem venues, make the neighborhood culturally irrelevant, then move in to fill the vacuum. By December 1959, Colombo's strategy was working. 3 major cultural events had been moved out of Harlem. 2 community art programs had lost their funding. The Apollo Theater was struggling to book major acts. Bumpy Johnson realized he wasn't just fighting for territory. He was fighting for Harlem's soul. November 15, 1959. Bumpy received intelligence that changed everything. His source was Maria Torino, an Italian-American woman who worked as a secretary for the Metropolitan Opera's board of directors. She was also one of the few people who knew that Bumpy had quietly been funding music education programs in Harlem schools for 15 years. "Mr. Johnson, there's something you need to know. Joe Colombo has reserved Box 12 for December 7th. He's calling it a cultural appreciation evening, but it's not for the opera." They were meeting in Central Park, away from listening ears and watching eyes. What's it really for? A planning meeting. He's bringing his entire leadership team. They're finalizing something they call the Harlem Solution. Bumpy sat in silence for a moment, watching pigeons in the fading autumn light. "Maria, how well do you know the Opera House's electrical systems?" What kind of question is that? The kind that might save Harlem's future. For the next 3 weeks, Bumpy Johnson became a student of 19th century architecture and electrical engineering. The Metropolitan Opera House, built in 1883, was a marvel of Victorian design, but a nightmare of outdated electrical systems. Gas lighting had been converted to electric in 1905, but the conversion was crude, layering new wiring over old gas pipes. More importantly, Box 12 was directly above the main electrical junction that powered the Opera House's lighting system. A fire in that box wouldn't just be contained to the box. It would create a spectacular blaze, visible to the entire audience. November 30th, exactly 1 week before Colombo's meeting, Bumpy made his first reconnaissance visit to the Opera House. He attended a performance of Carmen, dressed impeccably in evening wear, looking like any other cultured gentleman enjoying the arts. What he was actually doing was studying sight lines, exit routes, electrical panel locations, and most importantly, the ventilation system that connected Box 12 to the building's main air circulation. After the performance, while the audience filed out, Bumpy made his way to the building's basement, through a service corridor Maria had told him about. The electrical systems were exactly as she'd described, a maze of old wiring, new panels, and junction boxes that would create a perfect storm if ignited properly. December 5th, 2 days before the meeting, Bumpy acquired the materials he would need: Not explosives or gasoline. Those would leave evidence. Instead, he purchased electrical components that would create what investigators would call catastrophic system overload. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Overload the electrical system feeding Box 12 just as Colombo's meeting reached its most critical phase. The resulting fire would be intense, fast-moving, and completely inescapable for anyone trapped in the box. December 7th, 6 p.m., Joe Colombo arrived at the Metropolitan Opera House in a black Rolls-Royce, followed by 3 more luxury cars carrying his 14 most trusted associates. They looked like successful businessmen attending a cultural event, which in a way, they were. Colombo had chosen Box 12, not just for its privacy, but for its symbolism. It was the most prestigious box in the opera house, traditionally reserved for New York's most powerful families. By conducting his meeting there, he was making a statement about his place in the city's hierarchy. 7:30 p.m., the opera began. La Traviata, Verdi's tragic tale of love, sacrifice, and death. The irony wasn't lost on Bumpy, who was already in position in the building's basement, having entered through the same service corridor he'd used during reconnaissance. 8 p.m. during the first intermission, Colombo's real meeting began. While the audience mingled in the lobby, the 15 men in Box 12 spread maps and documents across the elegant seats, planning Harlem's cultural destruction. 8:30 p.m., Act 2 began. On stage, Violetta sang about love and loss. In Box 12, Joe Colombo outlined his final strategy. By spring, Harlem will be culturally isolated. No major performances, no funding, no legitimacy. Then we move in. 8:43 p.m., Bumpy activated his device. What happened next was later described by fire investigators as the most intense electrical fire in New York theater history. The junction box feeding Box 12 didn't just short-circuit, it exploded, sending superheated electrical current directly into the box's aging wiring. The flames appeared instantly, not small flames that gradually grew, but a wall of fire that engulfed the entire box in seconds. The combination of old wiring, vintage furnishings, and the pure oxygen being pumped through the ventilation system created a furnace that reached temperatures of over 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Joe Colombo and his 14 associates had perhaps 10 seconds to understand what was happening, 10 seconds to realize they were trapped, 10 seconds to scream before the heat became too intense for human survival. The audience below watched in horror as Box 12 became a crematorium. The screams were audible over Verdi's music until the heat damaged their vocal cords. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the smoke that began filling the opera house. 9:02 p.m. The fire department arrived, but Box 12 was already a total loss. 15 men reduced to charred remains in evening wear. The fire had been so intense that dental identification would be required for most of the victims. The evacuation was orderly, but panicked. 3,000 people filing out of the opera house while Box 12 continued burning above them. Many would later say it was the most terrifying cultural event they'd ever witnessed. By 10:30 p.m., the fire was extinguished. By midnight, the investigation had begun. By dawn, the conclusion was clear. Electrical fire caused by outdated wiring in a historic building. Tragic but accidental. Nobody suspected arson. Why would they? The fire had started in the building's electrical system, exactly where you'd expect a fire to start in an 1883 building with updated wiring. The victims were in the wrong place at the wrong time. What the investigators didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson had spent 3 weeks studying electrical fires, learning exactly how to make arson look like accident, understanding how to turn the opera house's own systems into a weapon. December 8th, the morning after the fire, the news was front page in every New York newspaper. Opera house tragedy kills 15 dominated the headlines. Joe Colombo's name was mentioned as one of the victims, but the focus was on the building's safety, not on who had died or why. The cultural impact was immediate and devastating. To Colombo's plans, not to Harlem. Without Joe Colombo's leadership, without his 14 key associates, the Harlem solution died with them in Box 12. The funding cuts were reversed. the cultural events returned to Harlem. The Apollo Theater resumed its full booking schedule. But the psychological impact went far beyond culture. Every crime boss in New York suddenly realized that Bumpy Johnson could reach them anywhere, even in the most public, prestigious venues in the city. If he could burn you alive at the Metropolitan Opera, where couldn't he kill you? For months after the Opera House fire, nervous mob figures avoided cultural events, stayed away from theaters, and hired fire inspectors to check any building before they entered. The paranoia was exactly what Bumpy intended, a reminder that he could turn any venue into a death trap. The Metropolitan Opera rebuilt Box 12 with modern electrical systems and enhanced fire safety features. They installed a memorial plaque honoring the victims of the December 7th tragedy, but they never identified those victims by name or mentioned their criminal connections. Years later, when investigative reporters tried to piece together the pattern of deaths surrounding Bumpy Johnson's enemies, the Opera House fire stood out as particularly audacious. The location was too public, the method too spectacular, the timing too convenient. But audacious isn't illegal, and convenience isn't evidence. Bumpy Johnson had learned long ago that the perfect murder isn't the one nobody suspects. It's the one where the investigation reaches the conclusion you want them to reach. In criminal circles, the Opera House fire became the gold standard for public assassination. Not because anyone could prove what happened, but because the message was unmistakable. Cross Bumpy Johnson, and you might find yourself burning alive in front of 3,000 witnesses who will remember your death forever. The genius of the Opera House assassination wasn't just the method, it was the cultural symbolism. Bumpy had killed Joe Colombo in the exact venue Colombo was trying to use against Harlem. The irony was perfect. The man who wanted to destroy Harlem's cultural soul died in a temple of culture, surrounded by art and beauty. The aftermath sent shockwaves through both the criminal underworld and New York's cultural establishment. Museums quietly reviewed their security protocols. Theaters hired additional fire inspectors. Cultural venues that had been considering Colombo-influenced decisions suddenly found reasons to reconsider. The Opera House fire also established a new rule in organized crime. Never underestimate Bumpy Johnson's reach. If he could orchestrate a mass execution at the Metropolitan Opera with 3,000 witnesses present, then nowhere was safe. No venue too public, no location too prestigious, no moment too sacred.